Hi, everyone. Excited to be here for this not boring panel. I'm Vanessa Grellet. I'm the head of portfolio growth at CoinFund, where I help companies scale and grow and get connectivity to enterprise to expand their products. I'm really excited to speak to you today with our panelists about the connectivity between Web3 and enterprise, and we'll see there's so much to unpack. So before we start, I would like to give the opportunity to our panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit what they're excited about before we dive into the questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Kokinos, CEO of Algorand. For those of you who don't know, Algorand is a public blockchain network, and the Algorand protocol was invented by Silvio Micali, who's a Turing Prize-winning cryptographer and a longtime computer science professor at MIT. And I think we're, really, I'm both excited about the discussion, but generally, I think we've seen adoption come from three primary areas. One is sort of crypto-native projects, especially around DeFi and NFTs, and we've seen some really interesting work around not only digital art, but things like music and video. The second is security tokens. We're seeing a lot of uptick there, and I think there's probably some like-minded thinking on stage here, and are really interested in kind of how more traditional assets start to participate in some of the DeFi tools that people are creating. And then finally, national projects, which is something that we're really excited about. We announced a couple of weeks ago that we're part of the infrastructure for El Salvador's project, Colombia's vaccine passport, and a bunch of others all run on Algorand. So we're, I think what we are most excited about, and then I'll let other people talk, is really these collisions between the more traditional world and the crypto world, and watching that start to happen.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Gu. I'm from Visa Crypto team, and I lead the global central bank digital currency engagement with many different central banks, but also kind of working very closely with many teams within Visa, trying to imagine what the future will look like for this entire digital payment space. Obviously, lots of things going on right now these days, and we're super excited with all the innovations that's been happening from the private sector. But more and more increasingly, we see that central banks and regulators are taking a much more keen interest and bringing up their expertise in understanding how would the future look like. So from our sort of Visa Crypto team, we're really trying to be the bridge in between the private and the public, and trying to think through the sort of product and infrastructure that we might be able to help to support as these digital payments become more mainstream and getting adopted for consumers and merchants.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Yuriy. I work at Anchorage Digital. Anchorage is a platform for institutions to access the digital asset space. We allow a secure way for clients to interact with custody, trading, lending, as well as on-chain services like staking, governance, and the like. And we were the first digitally native company that received the federal bank charter from the OCC back in January.
And so a first general question for our panelists, we see that enterprise and institutions see the innovation and the opportunity there. How do you think they're positioning sort of the centralized nature of their business or their activity versus the decentralized offering or promise of blockchain? And how do you reconcile both?
I mean, it's a good question. I think if I just sort of reflect on the past couple of years, you rewind to the beginning of that period, most enterprises and others, sort of took the stance that they wanted to have, they wanted to deploy things on private chains. We think that's pretty much nonsense, and that if you take a look at kind of large tech waves, public networks have won virtually every time. At least I can't come up with an example of private networks having won. And so I think what as we started to see kind of the blockchain and crypto space grow, there are certainly network effects that are driven, and also tools and applications that only exist in the public sphere on public networks. And I think what's happening is enterprises are effectively getting kind of dragged along with that because they see the benefit of it. And I think that more and more we'll start to see kind of additional participation from both enterprises, but also from people using those tools on the other side, which helps generate scale.
Yeah, and I think what I would like to add is basically in this space, there's so much still education need to be done first, and it's trying to get people to be crypto fluent enough to understand all these different varieties of choices and what does that mean in terms of the technical considerations and such, which I think is very important to do. So we're actually spending a lot of time with institutions as well as regulators and central banks, sort of sharing our views in terms of what we're looking at, have been growing the private, sort of all these public blockchain space, and how would that imply, when you are looking, say, considering permission-based, enterprise type upgrade of blockchains, and how that might be used for the future. So I think CBDC space also including that conversation in the sense that you already actually see many central banks are very curious about exploring these spaces. Algorand is one in which you guys are engaging with these to talk about CBDC infrastructure. So is many other enterprise grade like the R3/4, the Quorum network, JP Morgan Link. There's many type of sort of, I think, enterprise like blockchains emerging in this space, and I think that's going to be interesting to see how they will be adopted or integrated into these sort of new designs for CBDC going forward.
Yeah. And Anchorage, it's one of the most, if not the most, regulated companies, in the space. So one of the things that the OCC charter allows us to do is that we actually are allowed to provide the staking and governance services within a regulatory framework. So we have a lot of institutional clients, both crypto native and both from more of a traditional finance space that are in all sorts of different levels of investigating and learning, like Catherine said, education's a big part of it, of, what exactly do these, Web3, DeFi platforms really do, how to properly access them, and most importantly, as all of you obviously have been following, the regulatory landscape over the last few months has been kind of getting a little bit more intense, and we allow the customers basically to figure out how to properly access these platforms on a regulated scale.
Yuriy, I want to double down on that because we see that a lot of the recent adoption has been fueled by the excitement around DeFi and access to yield and these new opportunities for clients and institutions. How would you see Anchorage as an on-ramp capability, and how do you bring in traditional institutions to give them exposure to digital assets?
So I think Anchorage approaches this in two different ways, right? So one is we work with a lot of the protocols in order for them to be allowed to have, to facilitate clients' access to those protocols, right, in a seamless way. And then the other way too, it's we make sure that our clients are able to access those protocols like within the Anchorage framework. For example, if you're a digital native fund, smaller size, perhaps you do a $50,000 trade, use MetaMask, no problem, right? But if you're like a large hedge fund coming in from the traditional space and you're heavily regulated as well, doing a $50 million trade on MetaMask is probably a little bit more nerve-wracking, right? So Anchorage is spending a lot of time and engineering resources to build those rails so that institutional clients can access this again in a seamless and regulatory framework.
I'll just add one thing. I mean, I think that's very important, the distinction between audiences. The other is, there's a lot of people building stuff out here, I'm sure. I think some form of victory as the distinction blurs between finance and crypto is nobody should really know who Algorand is unless they care over time, or really kind of any of us. And I just encourage everybody who's out there building stuff to think about user experiences and how improving that is so critical to having more people use this. And those experiences extend into the enterprise, they extend into retail users. But I think in the end, what excites earning yield is something that's enterprises chase and institutions chase and retail users do as well. But making it easier for people to do that so they don't have to learn everything about smart contracts and everything else is really key.
Steve, you bring up a great point about user experience, which has been something that has been very crypto native in terms of where the innovation sits, and I think now needs to get a fresh look at. Let's put it this way. Catherine, you've been involved in CBDCs, and you've been doing a lot of research. You just published a paper on CBDCs and the building blocks that are necessary in order to drive adoption for this. And I think this applies to CBDCs. It also applies to stablecoins and cryptocurrencies. What is the opportunity that CBDCs bring to the table, and what are these building blocks that are necessary for everyone to be able to access them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So actually yesterday we published this thought leadership piece on CBDC through the Visa Navigate, so welcome anyone to take a read and yeah, to share your thoughts. I think CBDC is a very big sort of subject, and there's a lot of things that need to be done, which is why many central banks across the world, I think according to the BIS report earlier this year, over 86% of all the central banks around the world are starting to look at CBDC. Out of those, I believe about 60% of those are already considering pilot. 40 of those are starting to sort of plan them out and starting to actually execute these pilots in different stages. So I think in the next, say, 3 to 5 years, this space is going to be super interesting because it has a lot of implications from policy side, from the technology side, and from users and merchants, what they all mean in this new future with CBDC as part of that sort of space as well. So I think as we're also, by the way, in an exploration stage in terms of learning a lot as we're doing these engagement with central banks, understanding what's on the top of their mind. Because I think one key thing to highlight is that we don't think that there's one CBDC solution that's going to fit for every single country. And what that means is actually for each country, it's very important to understand what is the key motivation, what are the drivers that are influencing the policy makers to actually design the CBDC. Because once you identify those objectives and motivations, I think the technology solution will be there to help you to solve for that. And that's why right now we're spending a lot of time with central banks understanding those key motivations. And I would say that there's a lot of opportunities out there, but there's also threats. And then I think the threats is, you don't want to disintermediate the existing financial system, and that's crucial. And I think in the future of CBDC, you're probably going to expect what we call a two-tier model design, in which there really is hopefully like a good public and private partnership working very closely together to design the CBDC, but then in terms of distributing CBDC into the rest of the economy, you want to rely on the existing financial infrastructures, but also the incoming digital wallets, the fintechs of the world. They will in the future as digital payments to provide the additional sort of infrastructure to help to distribute these money. So I think the future is exciting in that sense because there's so many different players will coming into the scene and providing different infrastructures. And I guess at Visa, what we're doing right now is to spend a lot of time on the research, on the thought leadership. So some of the key research areas in which central banks are taking a keen interest, we're helping to sort of think through solutions. To give an example, we're looking at, for example, offline capabilities. And I think offline is a very interesting subject because, looking at CBDC as this digital version of cash, how in the future can you create that cash-like experience, but in a digital way so that, in an offline fashion, you can actually download the money onto your mobile phone and pay in a secure fashion? I think that's just super fascinating. It helps to drive the innovation, and hopefully, it creates new monetary flows because there could be interesting new use cases coming out. So lots of interesting, cool stuff going on there, and hopefully, we'd love to share more of these research with everyone here, because I do think, we need all these innovation to help to support and push what we're doing here forward.
I just wanted to add one thing on this. So we've done a number of national projects. We power Colombia's vaccine passport program is built on Algorand. We're El Salvador's national blockchain, which involves a number of different projects. And even places like Italy, they have a national music rights system. They deployed 4.5 million NFTs to Algorand for about 100,000 artists, so they can start processing royalties and allow for fractional ownership online. And I'm not diverging too far from what you're saying. I think what we found is in all these cases, understanding the technology is something that's very important at national scale because this is something that economies are going to rely on for the next 50, 100 years. And so understanding exactly like what the underlying theory is, what the science behind it is something that's very important. I think the other thing we're seeing more and more of is thinking about how do you custody assets? How are those held? If you're a central bank, how are you going to make sure that that's secure? And again, goes back to understanding, the underlying networks that you're running on and this. And so beyond that, I think there's sort of retail central bank digital currencies, which I think is largely what gets people excited. There's also bank-to-bank, digital currency projects that we see going on. And I think exactly how these things emanate is going to be interesting to watch, including, stablecoins have a role in this as well. And I think if you look at protocols like USDC, they've done really fascinating work and are really sort of creating new ways that programmable money can be used in kind of everyday commerce. And so I just sort of encourage everyone to sort of think a little bit more broadly when you think about central bank digital currencies and really sort of include a number of different projects and ways that people might approach it. And I think definitely it's a time of invention for central banks, and it's opportunity and a threat for them too, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. We see that it's going to take time to roll out CBDCs and a lot of education. And in the meantime, the innovation is continuing with stablecoins and driving further adoption and institution being able to leverage this innovation. So how do you see the future with CBDCs, stablecoins, and tokens, and how we're going to interact with all these assets, and what is necessary in order for adoption to become real?
That's a great question, and I would take it even one step further back in the sense, in the digital space, we're looking at things like digital currencies, including cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, CBDCs, these days NFTs as well. But really taking it in the whole big picture, we already have things that are digital in the sense, you have your Venmo, Revolut, you have all these real-time payments as well. So all that in the future, how do they coexist and how do they interoperate in between each other, I think is actually one of the key things that are facing a lot of us here, trying to think through what does the future look like if you want to, say, enable cross-border payments, whether that's on a B2B basis or it's just peer-to-peer, me sending money to my friend abroad. Maybe I can send in stablecoin, my friend receive that in the local CBDC at the end of that almost instantaneously. Those things might be possible, but I think you do need to think through these different technologies being built to support it. And I would say the other thing that's related to this conversation is when it comes to regulation and compliance. Obviously, you have more advanced technologies that will be happening out there in the future, but you still need to ensure the best-in-class sort of standards that you have sort of putting into the system to ensure all these payment networks can interoperate, but interoperate in a safe way that we are able to make sure that there's no sort of, I guess, malicious usage of money. Is also another challenge for people to navigate.
Yeah, and to add to that as well, stable coins in general, I think the one problem they really solved is the settlement issue after, let's say, a trade is made, right? So, when you're using US dollars, for example, if you're sending dollars to, a Coinbase or a Binance or whatever exchange you may use, well, those dollars don't actually get there, till 3 days later, which makes it for the companies not very capital efficient, right? Now with stablecoins, you can settle obviously 24/7. You can settle same day. You can settle within 10 minutes of your trade. So for hedge funds, for other asset managers, stablecoins and the CBDCs that'll come out will obviously just make the entire capital structure a lot more efficient in the day-to-day course of business. Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to add one area, which is focus on the retail aspect. And I think that actually goes back to Steve's point about user experience and understanding that is super crucial, because I think even the sort of digital wallet that we're using as of today, I mean, they're pretty good, but I think if you give it to a normal person who hasn't been touching crypto at all before, I think there's a lot of education to be done to help them to understand what are you doing with that, what's the difference, say, in the future between stablecoin and CBDC, because these things, as a normal spender, I think it's it might sound simple questions, but I think it deserves some more thoughts in the sense, would me in the future, in 5 years' time, have to switch between my money on Starbucks over to, I don't know, a CBDC token and then buy a cup of coffee, you know, like trying to think through the exact use cases that these sort of future of stablecoins and CBDCs can help to address is very important. And we're spending a lot of time trying to think through what could be the sort of the story, the personas out there, and you can apply the sort of the advantage that you get from things like CBDC to really help to solve these issues. So yeah, so there's a lot of conversation going on there.
Just one last thing on this topic. If you look at a place like El Salvador, they've onboarded something like half their population in 3 weeks to digital wallets. So I think if you look at what's possible in these sort of national scale applications, it's the ability to create scale and move quickly in some ways that is very difficult to replicate elsewhere. And I think one kind of last thing to think about is, it's very likely that we'll just have a world where there's more currencies than there are today. I mean, we already do. A lot of them created by people here. And I think that that's going to persist. And if that's the case, then people will sort of choose however they want to fund a transaction, and the transaction can just happen. But I think ultimately, if you look at things like AMMs and DEXs and other tools, those can all operate kind of behind the scenes. The users don't have to be aware, but it provides a totally seamless way for people to shift between one currency or another, kind of embedded in their everyday life. And so again, I think this is, it comes back to user experience, but this is really the plumbing for how finance just will work for everybody. And I think we're starting to see the seeds of it today. Now, largely everybody in America is doing fine financially, relatively compared to other parts of the world, and have access to good tools. But let's just say directionally, half of Latin America doesn't have a bank account at all. I think these are really important problems to solve. And if you can give people the right tools, one, it's immediate impact to GDP because you're taking out fees, especially remittances across border when people are sending money home, which is especially expensive and takes a long time, even more than a bank transfer. And beyond, if you kind of take a step further, now the tools that are being created in crypto give people that don't have access ability to earn yield and borrow and lend against what money they do have, and that's a big deal and a positive shift for people all over the world. So I think that there's really exciting prospects here, and there's definitely things that we have to kind of unpack and deal with, but I think it's good to remember that.
And Steve, Algorand has been working with El Salvador. Would love to learn more about, how you're providing blockchain for everyone there, and what are the building blocks, and what's important for institutions and large, stakeholders to roll out for this to be successful?
Yeah, well, there's a number of different, so payments are obviously one application that they've been using. There's others like a land registry, passports, so they're fully digitizing government services and putting them on the blockchain, which I think is going to be really fascinating to see. I think one of the things that's been interesting to watch there is it's required participation by the banks, the point of sale vendors, the mobile phone networks, and all those people are ultimately making it easy for people to use digital wallets. And so I think as a proof point, I think what they've shown is that you can shift how people transact pretty quickly if you want to, and that secondly, there's willingness to accept kind of digital currencies as payments, and that vendors have had to kind of line up to do it, but they have, and it hasn't been a big thing. But I think that's the big takeaway there is it's not just you don't give people wallets. If you give people wallets and there's nothing else they can do, they're not going to use them for very long, even if you give them money to incent them to do it. It has to be kind of an ecosystem of players that sort of come together and bring the right tools so that it's very seamless for everyone.
So we see the evolution, right, in the past 5 years. All the ideas were there, but they hadn't come to fruition with the maturity of where the players are right now and how large institutions are thinking about it. We have 6 minutes left. I would love our panelists to share where they see the most opportunities. Let's say you're an institution or you're a decentralized protocol and you want to create solutions and work with enterprise. Where would you focus your time? I
can start with an example. institutionally, like let's take an example of a money market fund, right? So the way it currently works, if you're a large company, let's say a Boeing or a Nike, you probably have somebody like JP Morgan who runs your money market platform for you. So whenever you have excess cash that you need to park overnight, over a week, you call up your sales guy to JP and you kind of say, all right, well, I have $1 billion I need to put in over the next 2 days. That PM then goes with his team, and then they decide where to invest that $2 billion, right? They look at Bloomberg, they'll call around the different brokers and figure out how to efficiently place that to get the most yield while preserving the liquidity profile that their portfolio requires, right? Now, in the DeFi and the Web3 space, do you really need that team of portfolio managers in order to do all that stuff more or less manually, right? We have already, like probably the most glaring example is probably Yearn Finance, where you can put your money in there, and the platform looks at other DeFi protocols, sees where the yield is, and optimally and efficiently places that money where it needs to go to maximize yield and minimize risk, right? So I think that's just one example, but there's a lot of similar examples that are very manual right now in the traditional finance space that I think a lot of the things that all three of our companies here are working on is going to make things a lot more efficient.
I guess I'll go next. I think just taking a survey of what are some of the live CBDC pilots real CBDC already out there. You're looking at, for example, in the Caribbean, there's the Bahama, who is the #1 first CBDC project out there called the Sand Dollar, as well as in the Eastern Caribbean, they have something called Dcash. I think, again, each country is very specific, driven by their specific motivations. But for these countries, for example, they're looking at, in order to solve for financial inclusion, in order to solve for the fact that there's still a heavy usage of cash. In fact, I think in Eastern Caribbean, there's so much usage of cash in between different islands that you actually have an airplane to fly cash every single day just to transport these. So to improve these sort of existing way things work, you're having the CBDC, and then trying to think through what are the new technology can help to inform, to improve the system. And then, on the other hand, you have Europe, you have the in Riksbank in Sweden, they're already starting the e-krona project. There is a decline of cash, and they're trying to see what is the alternative, what's the complement of the cash that central bank can still make it available to its citizens to use. Similarly, in the ECB in general, they're looking at digital euro. And when they're doing the survey in terms of asking for public responses to look at what are the key sort of requirements that you would like to see in terms of CBDC, the range of issues, privacy is the #1 thing, and then you have security to make the system secure and resilient, as well as lower cost for merchants and stuff. So I think having seen all these different examples, the key is that it's a very complicated topic. And I think there are many different areas of research and opportunities and technology innovation that can do there to anticipate what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years' time. And I would say, at least to share what we're doing here at Visa, I've already mentioned, offline capability. That's one really interesting area in which central banks are thinking through this digital experience of cash. How can I replicate it, but actually adding enhanced security to it so that you can hopefully minimize the risk associated with the cash version And also similarly, I think the second area of focus is going to be on interoperability, in the sense that you have all these fast payment, real-time payment system already out there, but now you're going to have all these CBDC networks in the future, and these CBDC networks will be using a combination, we think, of DLT as well as non-DLT technology as the backend infrastructure. So then the question becomes, how do you interoperate between different CBDC networks in the future to facilitate cross-border payments, as well as within all the existing infrastructures, so that you can ensure this smooth transition and focus on things such as merchant acceptance, that they don't need to require massive cost and investment to upgrade their system, as well as allowing consumer to enjoy the level of experience they already do, or even better in the future. These are key questions that, if you think through from the angle of what you want to achieve and then kind of working backwards, I guess, to figure out the opportunities, I think there's plenty of things that can be helped to solve.
Well, I guess from our standpoint, the way we think about it is, no offense to Visa, big institutions and enterprises aren't the people who drive innovation. It's new companies that sort of natively understand new technologies and that create new things. At the same time, I think it's just true that 95% of the world's capital still lives in traditional assets and more traditional places. And what really needs to happen is more of that capital needs to move on chain and take digital asset forms, and requires a whole series of plumbing. But that's going to be a set of incremental steps that happen over the next little bit. But I think certainly, the specter of, municipal bonds being issued on chain, and, when we talk about security tokens generically, if you think about things like mortgage-backed securities, the problem is if you're a fixed income desk, you invest in fixed income securities, there's a risk profile you have to match up to, and as interested as you might be in digital assets, you need assets to invest in that actually match up to the mandate that you have as an investor. And I think that that's what we're excited to watch start to happen more, is see more asset types start to migrate on chain, but leverage the really fascinating tools that people are creating in crypto, and and see how that helps people.
Yeah, so we see three exciting places for innovation: traditional finance and DeFi, payments, and then real assets, and transitioning the existing infrastructure on chain. We're out of time, but I really want to thank our panelists today for this exciting conversation and exciting perspective on what's coming up. Thank you.
All right.